internetnya mati guys. Internet mati guys. Belum, coba lihat di belumnya. Berarti kita bikinnya begini aja.
with the goal of hopefully teaching you how to design a way to select everything and delete. Awesome. So whenever I'm designing furniture, it's usually to fit a specific space or there's specific dimension requirements. So I always like to start with those, kind of model a box that represents that, and then model within those parameters. So in my model, the first thing that I'm going to do is draw the overall dimensions. So from the origin, with my line tool selected, I'll click once, start dragging to the right, and type 7 and the symbol for feet, which is an apostrophe, and hit enter. From there, I'm going to drag down along the green axis and type 20 and hit enter for 20 inches. Then I'm going to start dragging back to the left, and I could do this and type 7 feet again, like we did last time, but instead I'm just going to hold the shift button once my line has snapped to the red axis, and that's going to sort of freeze it to that axis. And from there, I'll just hover my mouse over the origin point and click again, and that's going to create a line the exact same length and parallel to my original line. Then finally, I can drag back up to my origin and click again to create my rectangle. Okay, down a design. All right, now to continue 1/4 of an inch thick, I'll just type in 19.25 and hit enter. Then to get out of the component so that I can stop editing it, I'll just get the selection tool and click on any blank space in my window. All right, so right now we've got a really long box, and we're definitely going to need some vertical partitions to keep things from sagging. So to model those, I'm going to get my rectangle tool and draw a rectangle face that perfectly matches which, so I'm not going to teach you something that I don't even know. But just click them and find the one that's right, and it'll kind of become muscle memory, even though you don't consciously know you're doing it. It's like, I don't know, making your heart beat or something. Okay, so back to what we were doing. Let's make sure that our vertical partition is selected, and then, okay, so here are different axes. Now by clicking this, now we're then moving my, and by far the easiest way to do that is by clicking in one corner, then moving my mouse to the diagonally opposite corner and clicking again. Then I'll get the push-pull tool, and I'm going to drag it towards the outside and type 0.75 since I want it to be 3/4 of an inch thick. And then I'll triple click it and hit G to make it a component. Now we're going to use another new tool, which is the move tool, which we can get by clicking this icon here or by typing M on our keyboard. Now with a bunch of tools in SketchUp, you can use your arrow keys to lock them to the 3 different axes. But even though you don't consciously know you're doing it. It's like, I don't know, making your heart beat or something. Okay, so back to what we were doing. Let's make sure that our vertical partition is selected, and then click M. And you'll notice that when we have the move tool selected, as we click the option or alt key on when component. So with the partition selected and the move and we move something, we'll just move that original component. And if it's on when we're moving something, it will leave the original component where it was and then move move tool selected. As we click the option or alt key on a Mac, it toggles this plus symbol on and off. So if it's off and we move something, we'll just move that original component. And if it's on when we're moving something, it will leave the original component where it was and then move a copy of that component. So with the partition selected and the move tool in duplicate mode, that's with the plus, I'm going to click once on the bottom left corner of the component and then move the duplicated component all the way over to the opposite side of the cabinet so that the left side of the component is flush with the left side of the right panel. In other words, my panels aren't to the inside of the side panels, they're actually on the inside of them, like a ghost going through them. Anyway, then I'm going to click again to release the object, and then without touching anything, I'm going to type / and 3 to divide the cabinet into 3 perfectly equal spaces. And you could type divide by 2, divide by 4, divide 6, divide a million. Well, probably not that. And it will make that many components in between the 2 that you have. You can also type ×2 or ×3, etc. to create duplicates another that far apart. So if you dragged it 12 inches, the next one would be another 12 inches farther down the line. But anyway, we just want 3, and we've got them as soon as we delete the 2 that are intersecting our side panels. And you can see here that now we have 3 equal-sized cubbies in our box. Okay, next I want to add some drawers to the leftmost cubby. So I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle that completely fills that cubby. Then I'll get the push-pull tool and push it into the background direction and type 0.75 for the thickness, and then go ahead and make it a component. Then I'm going to double-click it so that I can edit it, and then get my line tool and hover roughly over the center until I see it snap to the center, and then draw a line directly across my piece by holding shift as soon as I'm snapped to the red axis. And then I'm going to get my push-pull tool and push it in by 0.75, and that'll make it disappear. Next, I'm going to get the move tool and grab our drawer face right here at the top left corner and hit Alt so that we're duplicating the piece. And then we'll copy a duplicate underneath the original so that we have 2 equal-sized drawer faces filling our cubby. Now, another thing that makes components so useful is that, as you can see here, if we double click it and start editing one of the drawer faces, anything we do to that one component will happen to all the duplicates of that component. Okay, so I'm gonna undo all of that by hitting Command Z to undo a few times. And I'm also gonna show you that if you ever wanna make something that's a component not be a component anymore, I can right click it and choose Explode. And then if I alter the original, this one isn't gonna change anymore. But there's actually a better way to do this. So let's undo a couple times to get back of them both to being one single component. And then instead, I'm gonna right click and choose Make Unique. And that's gonna leave it as a component still, but it will be a unique component. And so editing it won't cause the other component to change. All that said, we actually do want these two to be duplicate components for now. So let's undo again a few times to get back to where we are. Them do right after we thank Squarespace for sponsoring this big not the time of things. We also make a website off that the put next goes into that axis. And I'm gonna sort of hover my mouse on this face of this panel here, which will make the one to the rectangle. So now I'm gonna zoom so that isn't recessed enough. So I'm gonna double click C alongside. So at this point, our cabinet's looking pretty good. So I guess maybe the next thing that we should do is add some goal, and then I'll type in a dimension. And I'm not sure how big I want this to, and then get the eraser tool. All right, up to the, kind of see how to the bottom right corner of the origin point to the cap. Faces, component, click, drag it. Basically, if you draw it, now I want this face, fire. Usually, and it's for the duplicate on the back chin, and the more in 2 point, we'll over to the other side. The only difference here is that we're gonna type divided by 2. At this point, that's guideline that double click guide with the ring sign. So go all the way up them. The top, just need to do pieces of the realize to get the so the befitting. Just copy my entire model and make the doors unique components and model in a new handle style. And then I can compare my model side by side to see what I like better. And I could also do this with bases and honestly really anything. And this is a super powerful design tool when I'm nailing down a design. All right, welcome back to part 2 of the SketchUp video series. So in part 1, we covered how to make basic shapes and how to make a virtual piece of furniture potential. And I'm gonna show you a way to make a nicer export or kind of a more artistic version of your models. Wrap my head or to do for every piece that I build. And I guess at the very least, by the time you've done part 1 and now part 2 of this series, you're gonna be more than proficient to model your own ideas in SketchUp. All right, so if you have not watched part 1, you definitely wanna go and do that now before you start in on part 2. And if you're modeling along, things are gonna move quite a bit more quickly because I'm just gonna assume that you've watched part 1 and that you understand what's going on. Also, be prepared to use the pause button a lot. Our model to make things a little bit easier to see on your end is first I'm gonna go to Window, Shadows, and turn those on. To Window, I'm gonna make it a little bit if you don't want, as if I up a big monolithic box that included the back panel. But maybe I've decided that I wanna use 3/4 inch plywood. So the first thing I'm gonna do is change that. So I'll use the ruler tool to mark a line 3/4 of an inch in from my top panel. And then I'm going to use the protractor to make a guideline at a 45-degree angle. And the reason that I'm doing this is because we're going to be using plywood, and a mitered joint's going to hide the plywood edges on the sides. But anyway, the way that you're going to do this is we'll click once here where we want the outside of our belt. Remember, we'll do that by making a panel. So the easiest way to recess a back panel in a mitered case is with a simple rabbet along the back edge partitions. Our panel sits in it. So to draw that, I'm going to make a pair of guidelines that are inset from each of that. So the much easier solution is to make my tenon just a little bit short. So rather than 16.5 inches, I'm just going to type 16, hit enter, and that's going to leave a 1/2 inch gap at the front. And then I will delete this line. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate my partition over here, delete the bottom half of the panel. So this is going to be a drawer face, and I want it to be 3/4 sort of flat face once to deselect it. So what we're going to do is you're basically just making the lines invisible rather than actually deleting them. And groove what's going to need to be. Then I'm going to get the push-pull tool and recess that in by 1/8 of an inch. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate the bottom panel and move it off to the right here so that you can see the problem that this is going to cause, which is that the groove is going to end a little bit shy of the bevel, where in actuality it would extend all the way to the end. So there's a few different ways that we can model this in. Then if we go over to the other side, everything in our model other than the doors and the panels that the doors are going to interact with, just to make it easier to explain this next part. And then erase the base. And then I can connect both of those. And I'm really just guessing here. But anyway, for this purpose, I think this looks good enough. So I'm going to make that a component and duplicate it and flip it over to the other side. The whole goal here is just to look at the two side by side to see which I prefer. And I actually think that I like this version on the left a little bit, another project. And then I'd buy 1 sheet of 1/2 inch material, which I'd use for my back panel, and essentially what I'm going to do is composite a few styles over one another, artistic look. So if I'm being honest, this one isn't great, but you can mess with it and you can get some pretty cool effects. All right, well, I'm going to leave this one here for now. So hopefully you enjoyed this series, and if you didn't welcome back everybody. This week I'm doing a All right, welcome back to part 2 of the SketchUp video series. So in part 1, we covered how to make basic shapes and how to navigate your workspace in SketchUp, and then we went through step by step and model top to leg. And doing this is pretty simple to explain, but it'll be even easier. Here's how I do it. Now, VPNs aren't mandatory for life on the web. Today we're going to build this mid-century modern inspired desk on 4 eyes. Make sure to include a link to that video in the description. Pretty regularly, and even I got the Ohm caboose.
There is no more basic wood joinery than the butt joint. A butt joint is nothing more than when one piece of wood butts into another, most often at a right angle or square to another board, and is fastened using mechanical fasteners. This type of joint is often used in wall framing on construction sites. A mitered butt joint is nearly the same as a basic butt joint, except that the two boards are joined at an angle instead of square to one another. The advantage is the mitered joint will not show any end grain and is more aesthetically pleasing. However, the mitered butt joint isn't all that strong. A pocket hole involves cutting a slot and pre-drilling a pilot hole at an angle between two boards before connecting the two with a screw. This pre-drilling needs to be very accurate, so it's typically accomplished by using a jig. Pocket joints work great for cabinet face frames and other similar applications where a lot of strength is not needed. A dado is nothing more than a square groove slot on one board where another board will fit. Similar to tongue and groove joinery, this is a commonly used wood joint for connecting plywood, such as building cabinetry. Another common wood joint used in cabinetry is the rabbet. A rabbet is essentially a dado cut along the edge of a board. Rabbets are often used at the back of cabinets and other similar assemblies for attaching the back to the sides of the box, adding a considerable amount of strength to the assembly. A sliding dovetail is a versatile joint with a lot of possible uses. A good way to think of it is as a locking dado. The half-lap joint is where half of each of the two boards being joined is removed, so that the two boards being joined together flush with one another. This type of wood joint can obviously weaken the strength of the two adjoining boards, but also is a stronger joint than butt joints. There are a number of projects where this type of wood joint is quite desirable in spite of its drawbacks. Of all wood joinery methods, the through dovetail may be the most revered. A classic through dovetail is beautiful and very strong, and adds a touch of class to any piece. There are a few methods for creating through dovetails, from hand cutting to machining with a jig. There are situations where a dovetail joint is the connection of choice, but both edges of the dovetail should not be visible. A perfect example is a drawer front, where you don't want to see the end of the through dovetail on the face of the drawer. For this type of joint, the best choice is a half-blind dovetail. Dovetail joints are beautiful and strong, but not always practical. A box joint is a simpler alternative to dovetail joints. A mortise and tenon is a classic wood joinery method. These joints have been used since the early times of woodworking and are still among the strongest and most elegant methods for joining wood. When joining two boards square to one another along a long edge, one can simply butt the joint together and hold it with fasteners. However, the tongue and groove joint is much stronger and provides more adjoining surface areas, which is particularly useful if you are going to glue the joint. Another method for joining boards along the edges, like the tongue and groove joint, is to cut slots and use beechwood wafers known as a biscuit to hold the boards in place. This is a very useful modern woodworking joint, particularly for creating tabletops, relying on glue and the swelling of the beechwood biscuit to hold the boards in place.
Welcome to Make Something with me, David Picciuto, and today I'm going to show you 10 different ways to make butt joints. 10. Check it. A butt joint is basically taking one piece of wood and button it up against another. If you only add glue to this, this is not a very strong joint because this is end grain. The end grain soaks in the glue, and this will eventually break, especially as wood expands and contracts. So, without further ado, let's get started. 1, glue and nails. So I'm gonna throw a little glue on here, butt it up against that. Not the strongest or the prettiest joint in the world, but it will get the job done. Number 2, screws and plugs. Special type of drill bit that drills a pilot hole and then counterbores the top for a plug. Over here at the drill press, I have a plug cutter that's going to cover up those holes. Then you throw a little glue in there. You want to match the grain. And then you pound them in. 3, pocket holes. Number 4, biscuits. Draw a little line there. Now that we got the 2 biscuit holes cut, fill that with gravy. Throw a biscuit in there. Number 5, domino, which is just like the biscuit, but uses a different machine. So once again, we'll make our mark.
Today we're going to talk about joinery. When doing a project, figuring out what sort of joinery you're going to use to assemble the whole thing is pretty crucial and basically what this whole woodworking thing is about. So if you want to be a better woodworker, it's important to know all the different joints you can make and where and why you would use them. But first, this video would not be possible without this week's amazing sponsor, Remarkable. This is the Remarkable 2 paper tablet, and this is how I'm going to keep this video organized. Let me show you. In today's world, we're connected and reachable at all hours of the day. If you use your computer or phone to design a project, it's very easy to get distracted by pop-up notifications, which are usually not even important. That's why I love Remarkable. It's designed for writing, reading, and sketching only, with no social media, email, or summer concert alerts to distract me from what needs to get done. I've always been a pen and paper girl, but my system was never efficient. I kept pads all over the place, so I was writing everything down. Only problem, I never knew which pad had what information. With the Remarkable paper tablet, everything is organized in one place, and it's a cloud-based note-taking system, so I can access my notes. I can add lots of different advice or wasted paper. Using it's pretty out to paper table. This seems like a bunch of straw. To this bundle on the edge, the glue will remain on the surface of the straws, so the glue can do its job of sticking these 2 bundles together. Now, look at the end grain of the straws. When you add glue, it just flows down the straw instead of remaining on the surface, so the glue can't do its job very well if it's no longer there. This right here is the reason why we have all these joinery techniques. Well, this and wood movement, but more on that in a little bit. Anyway, there are a few ways that you could go about making a butt joint stronger. First is by glue sizing, which just means to put a base layer of glue before you actually glue it. Some people mix the glue with water. Personally, I'm lazy and don't bother. I just apply a light coat and wait a couple of minutes for it to get soaked up into the end grain and dry a little bit. Then I do the actual glue up. Now the second layer won't get sucked up into the pores because it's blocked by the first layer, so it could remain on the surface and do its job. Now glue sizing does increase the strength a little bit, but there are definitely times when you'll want to reinforce it even more, and the easiest way to do this is with nails or screws. Nail holes could be filled with wood putty and screws could be covered up with plugs. You can use plugs that match the wood grain or use this as a design feature and create contrast with the plugs. I built this desk for my son over 3 years ago using butt joints that I simply screwed together, then added plugs as a design feature. And despite lots of comments in the YouTube video, it's still as solid as the day that I built it. If you want the reinforcement for a butt joint to be hidden, you have options, but my favorite, simplest method is the dowel joint. Dowel joinery is strong and versatile, and it can be achieved with inexpensive, limited tools. You basically just need a drill, but it's more precise if you also use a dowel jig. And there are a couple of awesome dowel jigs on the market, or you can make one like I did here. I'll link to this video where I made this and I show how to use it. I also have a lot of builds on my channel where dowels were the main method of joinery, like this desk and this nightstand. Another option is biscuits, but I'm personally not a fan, and I know biscuit lovers are going to argue down below. Anyway, another controversial method to reinforce a butt joint, and everyone's favorite, pocket holes. For those not aware, pocket holes are holes drilled at an angle so you can attach two boards with a screw at an angle. The benefit of pocket holes over regular screws is that you're not drilling into end grain with pocket holes. Using the straw analogy again, a screw will hold better when it's locked into the face or edge grain of a piece, as opposed to the end grain. Pocket holes are great because they're quick, strong, and easy to do, but they have a bad rap because people think they can use pocket holes for everything and anything, which is just not true. When I was a beginner, I wasn't aware of this, and I made this table where I joined breadboard ends with pocket holes. I got a hard lesson in wood movement on that build, and it was that experience that led me down the road of wanting to learn more about proper methods of joinery. So, what is wood movement? When the seasons change, the amount of moisture in the air changes as well. Where I live, it's dry in the winter and humid in the summer. So in the summer, wood will expand, and in the winter, it will shrink or contract. Think again of the straw analogy. All of these straws will fill with moisture, causing it to expand, and vice versa. But it doesn't just blow up like a balloon the same in all directions, and different cuts of wood will move differently as well. Like a plain sawn board will move more than a quarter sawn board, but I could do a whole separate video on this. The main point regarding wood movement is that the board will typically move the most going across the grain, and the wider the board is, the more it will move. On average, a 6-inch wide board will move about a 32nd, so really anything under 4 inches you just don't need to worry about. You also never need to worry about the length, and since your boards are probably under 4 inches thick, you don't need to worry about the thickness either. Back to pocket holes. If you have this wide board and attach it to the edge of another board using pocket holes, the board will want to expand and contract, but it can't move at the fixed points where the screws are. Instead of moving, it will crack. This is exactly what happened to this tabletop here. So never use pocket holes to attach breadboard ends, or to attach a tabletop to an apron, or to attach any wide board to the edge of another board. Me personally, I only use pocket holes for plywood because I know it's a stable material that won't move. Pocket holes are great for building plywood cabinets. All right, moving on to mitered butt joints. Still very simple, but a little more complex because an angle is involved. Usually you will have two pieces cut at 45 degrees to create a square corner, but they could really be cut at any angle to create any shape. This is a very common joint for frames, boxes, casework, a ton of applications, and just like a regular butt joint, there's the problem with exposed end grain. So there are multiple ways to reinforce this joint. But depending on your project, you may not need to reinforce it. I made this box a few years ago as a test to see if mitered boxes need reinforcement, and it didn't explode yet. That being said, if you do want to reinforce miters, there are a few ways. First up, we have the very common and beautiful splines. You can make the slots for the splines so many ways. Table saw jig, router table jig, trim router jig, hand saws, and more. The basic idea is to make a slot going across the joint. By doing this, you're exposing the edge grain of the wood on both parts, which will hold the glue better on its surface than the end grain will. Usually these splines are made of a contrasting color, and it becomes a really cool design feature for the project. You can see how the face grain on the splines are now going to come in contact with that exposed edge grain on both pieces in the slots, and that is how it reinforces the joint. Also note the grain direction on the splines. The grain is running across the joint. If you would flip the grain so it was running with the joint, it would defeat the purpose of adding the spline because it could crack along the grain easily. Splines are a very cool way to make a joint stronger and to add some design flair. Check out these brass splines I used on a tee box a few years ago. I thought that was pretty cool. And if you want the reinforcement to be hidden, you can use a hidden spline. Like anything in woodworking, multiple ways to cut this. I've used a jig at the router table to hold the workpiece at an angle to the router bit, or you can tilt your table saw blade and do it that way. Always options. Dowels are also a great way to reinforce the miter, and you can use a dowel jig to easily drill on the ends. Or if you like the exposed dowel look, there are options. You can drill a hole straight on so the dowel is exposed on one side, or you can drill a hole at an angle so the dowel is exposed on both sides. These are great opportunities to add design elements to your project by using contrasting woods. Now let's get into some more technical stuff. Let's talk about dados, grooves, and rabbets. These joints are very simple, but they're also the basis for a lot of other joints we're going to go over, so it's really important to cover them first. A groove is a channel that's cut along the wood grain, and a dado is a channel that's cut across the wood grain. And a rabbet is an open-ended channel that can go along or across the grain, but it's always on the edge of a piece. Since dados, grooves, and rabbets are essentially the same thing, they could all be cut the same way. Table saw by taking multiple passes with a single blade, or a dado blade if you have one. Miter saw with a stop locked in place. Router table or handheld router, where it would help to use some sort of jig like this exact width dado jig. Since the rabbet is on the edge of a workpiece, along with all the other methods, you can also use a special router bit called a rabbeting bit. It has a bearing that runs along the edge as it makes an open-ended groove. All of these joints, though, have an added benefit of alignment. No fussing around when trying to hold the workpiece in the correct position. If cut correctly, the pieces should just lock into their correct position, which is why I love using them. Dados are typically used to build cabinets or bookshelves, and grooves are typically used for holding drawer bottoms or for door panels. Typically, the depth is cut to about a third the thickness of the wood you're using. And these are super strong because the wood is captured on three sides, preventing it from moving or wobbling. Let's compare this screwed butt joint to a screwed dado joint. Over time with forces, a screwed butt joint may come loose because there's nothing preventing it from moving up or down. But it's much harder for a joint to come loose in a dado because it's trapped in position. A rabbet is very common for smaller parts, like drawers or for recessing the back of a cabinet. With a rabbet, the wood is not trapped on all sides because it's open-ended, so you will most likely need some extra reinforcement, like using pegs in a rabbeted drawer front or tacking the back of a rabbeted back panel with staples or brads. But like I mentioned, these joints are the basis of a lot of other joints. Check this out. If you flip the rabbet around and lock it in a dado or a groove, it creates a lock rabbet joint. Super satisfying and super strong. This brings us to our next joint, tongue and groove. We know what groove means, a channel cut along the grain of the wood. Now the mating piece, the tongue. This is cut by making two rabbets on either face of the wood. The remaining material left in the middle here is called a tongue. Typically, tongue and groove joinery is used to glue up large panels on long pieces. Since the edges of the pieces lock together, you don't have to worry too much about aligning them during the glue up, and they remain pretty flat. Only downside, you'll see the joint on the end, but that could be covered up or left as part of the design. Always options. Also always options when it comes to cutting them. They make these awesome router bit sets where one cuts the tongue and one cuts the groove, but there are a ton of other ways, and I went over in detail how to do these joints on my 6 ways to cover plywood edge banding video if you're interested in learning more. Moving on to lap joints. This is when an area is cut away from both pieces of wood so they lock into each other and become flush. If you look at it, lap joints are basically just dados and rabbets. When cut on the ends of these pieces, it's an open-ended notch, just like a rabbet. If you cut both pieces so you're
runners on these carcasses.
You're removing half the thickness in each board, you've created a half lap. If cut in the middle of two boards, you're cutting notches going across the grain, so they're just short dados. And this is called a cross lap. The hard part with lap joints is getting your depth of cut just right so it's removing exactly half of the material. This just comes with practice, but a good tip is to use two scraps, the same thickness as your workpieces. Cut a little bit on each end, then flip one to see if they become flush on their faces. If they're not, adjust the blade height accordingly. Regarding the width of the cut, half laps on the end are easier because it's open-ended, so you don't need to lock it in tight. You could just plane down any extra material that juts out after assembly. Cross laps, on the other hand, you really need to nail that width or you're going to have unsightly gaps. I use something called a kerf maker to get that dimension perfect every time, but there are other tricks as well, like using a shim that's the same size as your table saw blade. Place the mating material between a stop block and the workpiece, then make the cut. Now remove the mating material from between the stop block and replace it with a spacer piece that's the same thickness as your blade. Now make the second cut, then clear out the waste in the middle. You can see how this easily creates a perfect fitting cross lap, and because I know I'm going to get questions about the spacer, here's what would happen if you don't use it. Make the first cut with the mating piece between the stop block, remove mating piece, and don't add spacer. Make second cut and remove the waste in the middle. When you try to join this, you see a huge gap. Well, not huge, it's exactly the size of the table saw blade. So all you have to do is nudge it over a blade. One piece gets an open-ended slot cut on the end, and the mating, so mill up some extra material that these shoulders that go all the way around will hide the mating mortise, and the joint will be more seamless. The mortise part of the joint is the hard part because it's closed. You're going to mortise both up and down these mortises, and it's awesome, but notches on the ends of two pieces that will lock into each other by the edge grain. There are a ton of box joint jig tutorials out there, and they're so easy to cut for while building boxes. The dovetail joint, on the other hand, interlocks with wedges. So once assembled, looking at the faces of the board, it locks into place due to the angled cuts, and you don't even need glue. I used a stop sliding dovetail on the base of this record player stand I built, and it's really so simple. After removing the bulk of the waste for the slot, you can use a dovetail bit to cut the angled sides. This could also be done at possible with where the situation is just different. The answer is never universal. It depends